For about 2 decades, if you wanted to be seen as a serious, disciplined, results-driven company in corporate America, there was one management practice you copied without much question because the company that invented it was, at the time, considered the single best managed company on the planet. That company was General Electric. The practice was called the vitality curve, though almost nobody who lived through it called it that. They called it by its nickname Rank and Yank, and it is one of the clearest examples in modern business history of a system that looked brilliant on a slide deck and turned out to be quietly corrosive on the ground inside the very company that built it. To understand why GE built this system, you have to understand who was running the company and what problem he thought he was solving. Jack Welch became CEO of General Electric in 1981, and over the following 2 decades, he became arguably the most famous and most studied corporate executive in the world. Under his leadership, GE's market value grew from roughly $12 billion to somewhere north of $400 billion, an almost unbelievable expansion for a company that size. And Welch was given enormous credit for engineering it. He was blunt, aggressive, and deeply allergic to what he saw as corporate softness, the tendency of large organizations to let mediocre performance hide undisturbed inside a big enough headcount. His diagnosis was that most companies, GE included before his reforms, were too comfortable letting weak performers coast, protected by vague, subjective, feel-good performance reviews that almost never resulted in anyone actually being let go. Welch wanted brutal honesty about performance, forced onto the organization if necessary, because he believed most managers, left to their own judgment, would always rate everyone as good enough to avoid the discomfort of an honest conversation. So he built a system to force that honesty structurally, rather than leaving it up to individual managers' willingness to have hard conversations. Every year, every manager across the company had to rank the employees in their group into 3 tiers. The top 20% were labeled the A players, and they got the rewards, the biggest bonuses, the promotions, the stock options, the visible recognition. The middle 70%, the B players, were considered the backbone of the company, solid, necessary, but not showered with extra reward. And the bottom 10%, the C players, were let go. Not coached, not put on an improvement plan first in most versions of how this actually got implemented, just terminated every single year, regardless of whether that year's bottom 10% were, in any absolute sense, bad at their jobs. If your entire team was excellent, someone in that excellent team still had to be ranked into the bottom 10% and shown the door, because the curve was forced, not measured against an outside standard. Welch called this differentiation. He believed it was the fairest, most honest thing a company could do for its high performers, because it guaranteed that mediocrity could never quietly accumulate and drag the organization down. On paper, and in Welch's own writing and speeches, the logic sounds almost unassailable. Reward your best people generously, so they don't leave for a competitor. Remove your worst performers so they stop dragging down morale and output. Force managers to actually make the hard calls, instead of dodging them indefinitely. Plenty of companies looked at GE's stock chart through the 1980s and 1990s and concluded that this system, or at least a big part of it, must be a meaningful ingredient in that success, and they copied it. Versions of the vitality curve, sometimes softened, sometimes made even harsher, spread across corporate America through the 1990s and into the 2000s. Companies like Enron adopted aggressive forced ranking systems. And while Enron's collapse had many causes far beyond performance reviews, its ranking culture became one more data point people pointed back to later when the backlash against forced ranking finally arrived in full force. Microsoft ran a version of stack ranking for years, and it became one of the most publicly criticized elements of the company's culture during the 2000s. Blamed by many former employees and journalists for internal dysfunction during a period when the company's innovation output was widely seen as slowing down. So what actually went wrong, mechanically, inside these systems? The core problem is almost embarrassingly simple once you say it out loud. When you tell people that a fixed percentage of their group will be fired every single year no matter how the group performs as a whole, you have not created an incentive to help the team get better. You have created an incentive to make sure you personally are not the person standing in that bottom bucket when the music stops. And those two incentives are not the same thing, and very often they actively point in opposite directions. Think about what that does to collaboration first, because this is where the damage was most immediate and most widely reported by people who actually worked under these systems. If you know that helping a struggling coworker improve might mean that coworker no longer looks like the weakest link in the group, and that someone has to occupy that bottom slot, helping them stop struggling doesn't protect you. It just moves the target closer to you. Employees under forced ranking systems across multiple companies that adopted versions of this reported the same pattern independently. Colleagues stopped sharing useful information freely, stopped offering help on shared projects, sometimes actively withheld resources or context that would have made a struggling teammate's life easier, because a struggling teammate ranked below you was, in a very direct and personal sense, protecting your own job. Cross-team collaboration, the kind of spontaneous knowledge sharing that makes an organization smarter over time, quietly dried up in teams operating under this pressure, replaced by a kind of wary self-protection that never showed up as a line item anywhere but was felt by everyone inside it. Now think about what it did to hiring, which is a subtler but equally damaging effect. A manager operating under a forced ranking system has a strange, perverse incentive when staffing their own team. Every strong candidate they bring in doesn't just add capability, it also adds competition for the top slots and pushes the ranking pressure down onto someone else on the existing team. Some managers, entirely rationally given the system they were operating inside, became quietly reluctant to hire the most impressive candidate available because a team full of stars just meant someone excellent would inevitably rank in the bottom 10% purely by comparison, and that manager would then have to fire someone who, by any outside standard, was doing a genuinely good job. It is a strange and almost absurd outcome for a system that was explicitly designed to reward excellence, but it followed logically and predictably from how the incentive was actually structured. And multiple former GE and Microsoft managers described exactly this calculation in later interviews and retrospectives about the era. And think about what it did to how people actually spent their time and attention day to day. Once employees understood that their ranking, not their raw output, determined whether they kept their job, a meaningful share of energy shifted toward managing the ranking itself rather than managing the work. That could mean lobbying your manager directly about your standing before review season. It could mean choosing safer, lower-risk projects specifically because a visible failure could tank your relative ranking, even if that same risky project might have been the most valuable thing you could have attempted for the company as a whole. It could mean carefully documenting your own contributions while quietly failing to document a struggling colleague's genuine improvements because a colleague's visible improvement changed the comparison you were both being measured against. None of this was necessarily malicious in the dramatic sense. It was people responding rationally to a system that explicitly told them every single year that their relative position mattered more than their absolute contribution. There's a sales floor version of this same story that's worth walking through separately, because sales organizations were some of the most enthusiastic adopters of forced ranking outside of GE itself, and the way it played out there is particularly vivid. Picture a regional sales team of 15 people, ranked every quarter, with the bottom performer or two rotated out, regardless of whether the whole team had a record quarter or a terrible one. In a strong quarter, when a competitor's product stumbled and every single rep on the team closed more deals than usual, someone still had to rank last, and that person still got managed out, even though their absolute numbers might have beaten what the top performer on the team was producing 18 months earlier. Reps who understood this dynamic began quietly declining to share effective pitch techniques, successful objection handling scripts, or useful competitive intelligence with teammates, because a rising tide on the team just meant the bar for staying employed kept rising too, and no individual rep benefited from lifting everyone else up. Sales leaders who ran these systems for years later described watching genuinely talented reps leave voluntarily the moment a strong new hire joined their region, not because the new hire had done anything wrong, but because the incumbent rep could do the math and see their own relative ranking was about to get harder to defend through no fault of their own performance. Healthcare and hospital administration offers a slightly different angle on the same underlying flaw, one where the stakes of discouraged collaboration are especially visible. Some hospital systems experimented with forced distribution performance reviews for clinical staff, ranking nurses or physicians against their peers within a department. The obvious hoped-for effect was raising the floor on patient care by identifying and removing consistently weak performers. What some of these systems found instead was a chilling effect on exactly the kind of behavior hospitals depend on most: staff flagging their own near misses and errors openly so the whole team could learn from them, and staff asking peers for help on complex cases before a mistake happened, rather than after. When your standing relative to your peers determines your job security, openly admitting uncertainty or asking for help starts to look like handing ammunition to whoever's compiling this quarter's rankings, and that instinct runs directly counter to the culture of open reporting that patient safety research consistently identifies as the single strongest predictor of fewer serious errors. A handful of these hospital systems reversed course on forced ranking, specifically because leadership noticed error reporting rates dropping in ways that looked less like actual improvement and more like people simply going quiet. Welch himself always insisted the system was working as intended, and to be fair to him, GE's results through most of his tenure were genuinely extraordinary by almost any measure you want to use. But the costs accumulated quietly, mostly invisible in any single year's numbers, and they showed up specifically in the years and events after Welch's own departure. GE's culture in the years following his 2001 retirement was repeatedly described by former employees and by outside journalists covering the company's latest struggles as one where short-term individual positioning had become deeply embedded, sometimes at the direct expense of longer-term collaborative thinking, exactly the kind of thinking that becomes critical when a large, complex company needs to navigate a genuine crisis rather than simply execute a familiar playbook during good times. And there was a specific recurring pattern that showed up across nearly every company that tried forced ranking. Top performers, the very people the system claimed to protect and reward, would leave the moment their own ranking dipped even slightly in an otherwise strong year because they'd internalized, correctly, that the system measured them against their peers rather than against any fixed, stable standard, and a strong year with unusually strong peers could still tank their relative position through no fault of their own. Losing your best people specifically because the system that was designed to retain them had made their position feel arbitrary and unstable is about as clear a sign of a broken incentive as you can find. GE itself formally scrapped forced ranking in 2015, a full 14 years after Welch left the CEO seat, once internal evidence had piled up showing that the forced curve was punishing people somewhat arbitrarily, particularly in teams that happened to be unusually strong that year, and that the system was costing the company more in collaboration, retention, and morale than it was gaining in performance clarity. The company that had built Rank and Yank into a symbol of disciplined management ended up quietly walking away from it, which is about as strong a real-world verdict as you're likely to get on any management practice. None of this means performance measurement itself is the villain here, and it's worth being precise about what actually broke, because the instinct some managers take from this story, never rank anyone, never make hard calls, treat every performance conversation as equally soft, throws out something genuinely valuable along with the broken part. Welch was right that most organizations, left unmanaged, drift toward vague, conflict-avoidant performance reviews where almost nobody is ever told clearly that their work isn't good enough, and that drift really does hurt both the company and, honestly, the underperforming employee who deserves honest feedback rather than years of vague, comfortable mediocrity that eventually ends in a surprise layoff with no warning. The problem was never honesty about performance. The problem was one very specific design choice: a mandatory bottom bucket, sized as a fixed percentage of the group, with no reference to any external, objective standard. That distinction is the whole ballgame, and it's worth sitting with directly. A ranking system where you compare employees only against each other, with a fixed number guaranteed to land in the danger zone, no matter how the group performs collectively, always teaches people to protect their relative position because their fate is entirely determined by their peers' performance, not their own. A system that instead measures people against a fixed, well-defined bar of what meeting expectations and exceeding expectations actually look like removes that specific pathology completely. Under a fixed bar system, if every single person on your team genuinely exceeds the bar this year, every single person can be rated highly and rewarded, and nobody has to be sacrificed just to maintain a curve. Helping a struggling teammate clear the bar helps you too, because your own rating was never determined by where you stood relative to them in the first place. Hiring the most talented person you can find becomes an unambiguous win again, instead of a quiet threat to your own position. A fixed bar keeps competitive energy pointed outward at the actual work and the actual market, where it belongs, instead of pointed sideways at the people sitting one desk over. If you're a manager designing or inheriting a performance review system right now, the practical move is to look hard at whether your bottom category is defined by a fixed percentage of your group or by a fixed, articulable standard of performance that exists independently of who else happens to be on the team that year. If it's the former, you very likely have some version of GE's problem quietly running inside your organization, even if nobody's called it rank and yank out loud in years, and even if your version feels gentler on the surface, dressed up in softer language like calibration or distribution guidelines. The fix isn't abandoning honest feedback, and it isn't refusing to ever let anyone go for genuinely poor performance. The fix is making sure that when someone is rated poorly, it's because they didn't meet a real, stable, describable bar, not because they happen to be standing next to someone better this particular year. There's a practical test you can run on your own review system this week, and it's simpler than it sounds. Ask whether it's structurally possible, on paper, for every single person in a group to receive the top rating in the same cycle, if every single one of them genuinely earned it. If the answer is no, if the system has a hard ceiling on how many people can be rated highly regardless of how well the whole group actually performed, you're running some flavor of forced distribution, whatever it's called internally, and you should expect the same collaboration-killing side effects described here to be quietly present, whether or not anyone has complained about them out loud yet. Conversely, ask whether it's possible for every person to land in the bottom category in a genuinely bad year for the group, say, after losing a major client or shipping a failed product. If your system makes that structurally impossible too, because someone always has to occupy the top slots no matter how the team actually did, you have the same core flaw wearing a different mask. A healthy system lets the whole distribution shift honestly with reality in either direction, good year or bad, rather than being locked to a fixed shape regardless of what actually happened. That one test, run honestly against your own company's review template, will tell you more about whether you've quietly inherited GE's mistake than any amount of reading about Jack Welch ever will. What's your take? Have you ever worked inside a forced ranking system yourself, and did it bring out the honest performance culture it promised, or the quiet self-protection this story describes? Drop your experience in the comments below.